The night of July 9th, 1943, settled heavy over Sicily like a damp shroud. Wind screamed in off the Mediterranean, bending scrub grass and rattling the shutters of farmhouses already hollowed by hunger. In a shallow trench outside Gela, 19-year-old Private Enrico Bianchi hunched low, his Carcano rifle balanced across his knees. The sand was damp from salt spray, and the barrel was already slick with condensation. He drew his thin greatcoat tighter, listening to the gale and convincing himself the storm was a blessing. No sane navy, he thought, would try to land an army in this weather. Orders had been vague, like most given to conscripts in the Italian Sixth Army. General Alfredo Guzzoni commanded from Palermo, but to Enrico and his squad, the war existed only as rumors from officers, whispers of Germans arriving, of Mussolini's speeches promising renewed strength, of British convoys somewhere far off. What he knew for certain was scarcity. Ammunition rationed, boots worn thin, food cut down to crusts of bread and watery soup. Sicily itself seemed exhausted, villages crumbling, civilians gaunt and watchful. The trench stank of wet earth and unwashed men. Beside him, Corporal DeMarco muttered that the gods of Rome had surely sent this storm to keep them safe. Enrico tried to believe it. The wind lashed so violently that even the coastal guns nearby had gone silent, barrels swinging like weather vanes. Then, sometime near dawn, the horizon began to darken, not with storm clouds, but with shapes too solid, too deliberate. At first, Enrico thought the gale was playing tricks, waves forming unnatural silhouettes. But as the light came, the sea itself appeared armored. Ships stretched across the water farther than he could see, black outlines packed so close that surf seemed squeezed between their hulls. Destroyers, cruisers, transports, landing craft, thousands of tons of steel rolling relentlessly forward. Later, historians would tally more than 3,000 Allied vessels converging on the southern coast that morning, the greatest amphibious armada yet assembled. To a 19-year-old conscript with a 5-shot bolt-action rifle, it looked like the end of the world. The impossible statistic would emerge only later. America alone was producing ships faster than the Axis could sink them. A single Liberty ship might roll off the ways in 40 days, sometimes in less than a week, while Italy's entire wartime tonnage struggled to match a single U.S. shipyard's output. But Enrico didn't need figures to understand the meaning. He could see it in the dark horizon swallowing the dawn. The gale still blew, tearing at his coat and stinging his eyes with salt. But the storm no longer mattered. The invasion had arrived. By first light on July 10, 1943, the truth was undeniable. What Enrico Bianchi had mistaken for a handful of ships in the mist was only the vanguard. As the sun clawed above the sea, the scale revealed itself. Vessels so numerous they seemed to pave the ocean. Liberty ships sat deep in the water, holds packed with tanks and rations. Flat-bowed LSTS, landing ships, tank, lined up like iron giants, waiting their turn to grind toward the beach, each capable of disgorging armored columns directly onto sand. Closer still, smaller craft darted like insects, LCIS, LCVPS, Higgins boats. American sailors called it routine, just another landing in the long chain of operations that had begun in North Africa. But for Sicilian civilians watching from ridgelines, and for Italian conscripts like Enrico in their shallow trenches, it was as if an entire continent had crossed the sea overnight. Even the surf could not stop them. 5-foot waves battered the landing craft, swamping some, scattering others. Yet the tide kept coming. Captain John Miller of the U.S. Army Service Forces stood on the deck of a command vessel with clipboard in hand, scanning manifests as if managing a warehouse rather than an invasion. To him, the poetry lay in numbers. Tonnage unloaded per hour, trucks lined up nose to tail, rations calculated down to the last chocolate bar. His job was not glory, but movement, making sure that every bullet, every jeep, every gallon of fuel flowed seamlessly from ship to shore. Behind him, Liberty ships loomed, each a floating factory's triumph. By war's end, 2,710 would be launched, enough steel to build a new merchant fleet from scratch. On shore, Enrico blinked in disbelief as amphibious craft disgorged men in endless lines. They carried rifles unlike his Carcano, sleek, semi-automatic M1 Garands that spat 8 rounds as fast as a man could squeeze the trigger. The rattle of their fire was alien, a staccato too quick to count. Tanks clanked down LST ramps, Shermans already dusted with Sicilian sand before the morning was old. Lucia Romano, a farmer's daughter from a nearby village, watched from a hillside. She had seen her brothers sent to the front with patched uniforms and brittle helmets. Now she saw Americans land with mountains of crates, food, fuel, and even cigarettes stacked higher than her family's farmhouse. The revelation crept in with the morning sun. This was not an army arriving. This was a machine, self-sustaining, endless. For every craft dashed against the rocks, another slid from the horizon to take its place. What Enrico thought had been the invasion fleet was only the first wave. The thunder came not from the sky, but from the sea. At mid-morning on July 10th, as Italian armor of the Livorno division rumbled toward Gela, the coastal plain shook with a violence few had imagined. The tanks, thin-skinned Semoventes and French-built Renault R-35s, clattered along dusty roads, their commanders determined to push the Americans back into the surf. Infantry followed in scattered ranks, rifles and grenades ready, driven less by faith in victory than by discipline drilled in barracks. Then the horizon erupted. U.S. Navy destroyers swung broadside, their 5-inch batteries barking in perfect rhythm. Each shell streaked inland with a scream, exploding among the Italian columns with concussive force. A light cruiser added its weight, sending high explosive rounds into crossroads, orchards, and assembly areas where Enrico and his comrades had tried to regroup. It was artillery beyond anything the Italian army could match, mobile, precise, unending. Enrico threw himself flat, ears ringing, as dirt showered his trench. He glimpsed one of his division's tanks lurch sideways, tracks blown off, its thin armor peeled back like tin. Soldiers scrambled for cover, their counterattack collapsing before it had begun. The shock was not just destruction, but the revelation that the sea itself had become an American fortress, hurling steel inland with inexhaustible fury. Nearby, Sicilian civilians like Lucia Romano clutched their children as windows shattered. The very earth seemed to pulse with each salvo, dust rising from beams and stones already weakened by years of neglect. To her, it felt as though Mount Etna itself had awakened. Later records would confirm the numbers, dozens of destroyers and cruisers firing thousands of shells in support of the beachhead. The statistics stagger even now. Naval firepower that in a single morning outstripped what Italian artillery could deliver in weeks. For Enrico, the meaning was simpler. He had grown up hearing of Roman legions and Mussolini's boasts, yet here he watched an entire division shredded not by men on the ground, but by warships miles offshore, each one a floating battery supplied by America's limitless industry. Smoke blanketed the coastal plain, blotting out the sun. The Italian counterattack, planned with such fragile hope, dissolved in fire and chaos. Enrico pressed his cheek into the soil and realized his rifle was useless against thunder that came from beyond the horizon. The sea had spoken, and it spoke with an American accent. The invasion did not end with gunfire. Once the naval salvos silenced Italy's response, the true nature of American power revealed itself on the beaches. Enrico, now disarmed and dazed, stumbled past lines of prisoners gathered by military police. He watched in disbelief as waves of vehicles seemed to materialize directly from the sea. The first were DUKWS, ungainly, six-wheeled trucks that waddled ashore through surf as if the ocean were merely another road. Each carried 25 soldiers or 5,000 pounds of cargo, rolling from salt water to sand without pause. Enrico had never seen such a thing. Italy possessed no equivalent. Where his army relied on mule trains and creaking lorries, America delivered its war wagons amphibious, ready to carry crates of ammunition or men straight into battle. Behind them came the tanks. LSTS landing ships tank dropped their bow doors, steel ramps slamming onto wet sand. Outclanked Sherman tanks, engines growling, their tracks churning foam into mud. To Enrico's ears, it was mechanical music, a chorus of steel voices proclaiming that resistance was futile. Captain John Miller walked the shoreline with clipboard in hand, his boots sinking in sand. For him, this was choreography. Seabees wrestled pontoon causeways into place, linking ship to shore like improvised highways. Crates of rations, artillery shells, and fuel drums rolled down in endless lines. Every hour brought more: jeeps, bulldozers, even field kitchens. Miller knew the numbers by heart. A single Liberty ship could disgorge 9,000 tons of cargo. An American shipyard could launch one every few weeks. Together, they formed a pipeline across the Atlantic, an artery of abundance. To the Sicilian civilians watching from nearby ridges, it was surreal. Where their villages starved, the invaders carried mountains of food. Lucia Romano saw chocolate bars passed from soldiers to children, tins of meat stacked higher than her father's cart. The abundance mocked the empty shelves of fascist Italy. For Enrico, the revelation was undeniable. This was no fragile expedition, no desperate gamble across the sea. It was a machine, relentless, self-feeding, unstoppable. The gale had failed to halt it, Italian tanks had shattered against it, and now the ocean itself seemed to supply its gears. He stood in silence, dust in his hair, shackled by the thought that he had been fighting a myth. The Americans had not merely brought an army, they had brought a nation's factories to the shore. Even the sea was no barrier to their machine. The battle for Gela ended not with a last stand, but with hands raised. By the afternoon of July 11th, thousands of Italian soldiers, including Enrico Bianchi, had been marched to improvised stockades near the beach. Guards with Garans stood watch as prisoners slumped in the heat, their uniforms caked with dust, their faces hollow from sleepless nights. Enrico expected harsh treatment. Italian propaganda had painted Americans as cruel, crude men. Yet when the first rations arrived, the surprise was almost greater than the sight of the invasion fleet itself. The meal was plain by American standards: white bread, Spam, black coffee poured from GI tins. But for men who had subsisted on stale crusts and watery broth, it was a feast. Enrico tore into the bread, marveling at its softness. Spam, salty, oily, utterly foreign, seemed like luxury. He chewed slowly, watching other prisoners devour their portions with disbelief. Within days, columns of prisoners of war were herded to ports. Liberty ships, empty of tanks and fuel after unloading, now carried prisoners across the Mediterranean. Enrico and his companions crowded into steel holds fitted with bunks and guarded by young American MPs. Even here, the scale impressed him. He overheard an officer casually remark that one Liberty ship was being launched every 42 days, some faster. To Enrico, the idea seemed impossible. Italy had struggled to keep a handful of freighters afloat, and America replaced entire fleets in months. Crossing the Atlantic, Enrico tasted canned fruit for the first time. Peaches sealed in syrup, sweet beyond memory. Guards distributed cigarettes by the carton, brands with names like Lucky Strike and Camel, luxuries Enrico's father would never have seen in wartime Naples. In moments like these, he understood that the Americans were not merely soldiers, but representatives of an entire industrial system. They could afford to feed and comfort their enemies with goods Italy could not provide to its own civilians. There was irony in the voyage. Men who had fought for fascist Italy now rested in hammocks on American ships, guarded yet well supplied, bound not for prison dungeons, but for camps in Texas, Arkansas, and Indiana. For Enrico, the voyage was both humiliation and revelation. Defeat had stripped him of weapon and uniform, yet captivity offered bread, meat, fruit, and tobacco, comforts beyond reach in Mussolini's empire. As the convoy neared the American coast, Enrico leaned against the steel rail, staring at the endless line of ships steaming in formation. The horizon bristled with funnels and masts, each carrying supplies or men, each proof of a power his homeland could never match. For the first time, he wondered if defeat was not disaster but truth revealed. The Arkansas summer sun beat down on the parade ground as trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Monticello. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the clearing, each painted a uniform khaki, each surrounded by barbed wire strung tight as harp strings. This was no dungeon but a small city, built in weeks by American engineers and supplied with a thoroughness that staggered the new arrivals. Enrico shuffled through with hundreds of other Italian officers and enlisted men. He expected filth, meager food, and cruelty. Instead, he was issued bedding, work clothes, and shown to a clean barrack with electric lights. The mess hall menu astonished him: hot dogs, corn on the cob, even desserts like Jell-O. Americans treated food as casually abundant, offering dishes that seemed decadent after years of Italian shortages. The Geneva Conventions were observed with precision. Prisoners were allowed religious services, recreation fields, and even camp newspapers. Enrico met fellow POWs who had already begun organizing soccer matches and choir groups. He also met Dr. Alberto Burri, a captured army medic turned reluctant artist. Burri spoke little at first, but in evenings he began sketching with materials provided by camp staff. His work would later make him famous, but to Enrico, it was proof that even prisoners could find new purpose in this strange land of plenty. American guards were firm, but not brutal. Some spoke to prisoners with curiosity, asking about Sicily, about Rome, even about pasta recipes. For men who had been told they were fighting monsters, the realization was disarming. Enrico saw guards eat the same food served to prisoners, drink the same coffee, smoke the same cigarettes. Scarcity seemed absent from every corner of American life. The most startling revelation came with pay. Prisoners who volunteered for labor in the fields or in supply depots received wages, small by American standards but astonishing to Italians. Enrico watched men pocket coins and buy items from the camp PX: chocolate, razors, writing paper. It was a reminder that America possessed not only the power to conquer, but the resources to employ even its captured enemies. Each day, trains rattled in and out of the nearby station, carrying supplies, mail, and sometimes groups of Italian volunteers joining the newly formed Italian service units. These men wore U.S. uniforms marked with Italy and helped unload ships, repair equipment, or tend farms. Nearly 45,000 would eventually join. To Enrico, it was unthinkable. Yesterday's soldiers of Mussolini now fueling the very machine that had crushed them. At night, lying on his bunk, Enrico listened to the hum of electric fans and the laughter of men playing cards by lantern light. Outside, the American flag snapped in the breeze. Inside, he realized, America had already conquered with something more potent than weapons. It had conquered with abundance. The Texas plains stretched wide under a merciless sun when Enrico's transport finally reached Camp Hereford. Barbed wire enclosed the compound, but inside, life bore little resemblance to the grim prison camps whispered about back home. Here the prisoners built a community. Officers carved gardens in the dust, held mass in makeshift chapels, and staged plays that brought laughter to evenings otherwise filled with homesick silence. Among them was Alberto Burri, once a doctor, captured in Tunisia in May 1943. Burri now found himself without patience but with restless hands. From Red Cross parcels and camp supplies, he scavenged burlap, rags, and paint. In a drafty barrack, he began to create, first sketches, then collages, eventually paintings that seemed to turn scraps into visions. His art spoke of confinement, but also of possibility, of transformation within captivity. To Enrico, who often stopped to watch, it was startling. Italy had offered him discipline and deprivation. America offered tools, light, and time. Daily life in Hereford reinforced the revelation. Meals remained plentiful: meat, vegetables, even coffee. Prisoners worked on local farms, earning small wages that bought soap, cigarettes, or even musical instruments from the camp canteen. Soccer games drew crowds, with Americans sometimes joining in. Guards enforced rules firmly, but their treatment was consistent, predictable, a far cry from the chaos and corruption that had defined Italy's collapsing regime. For many Italians, the experience was disorienting. Mussolini had promised glory and destiny, yet his soldiers found dignity and sustenance in the hands of their supposed enemies. The irony stung, but it also healed. Letters from home described hunger and fear. Inside the wire, men ate regularly, created art, and even pursued studies with books supplied by American charities. One afternoon, Enrico sat in the camp library, a room lined with donated volumes, and listened to Burri explain why he painted. "If we are prisoners," Burri said, "then let us make something the war cannot destroy." Enrico thought of the Sherman tanks that had clattered onto Sicilian beaches, of the Liberty ships rolling endlessly from American shipyards. The United States seemed able to create without limit: ships, weapons, even opportunities for its captives. Hereford became for him less a prison than a mirror. It reflected the contrast between two systems: fascist Italy, which could not feed its own citizens, and democratic America, which fed its enemies and gave them brushes, footballs, and pay slips. The barbed wire remained, sharp in the sun, but Enrico realized the Americans had already conquered in the most enduring way. They had proven their system worked better, even for those who had come to destroy it. While prisoners adjusted to life behind American fences, the machinery that had placed them there thundered on. Across the Atlantic, factory whistles shrieked in unison, assembly lines clattered without pause, and the impossible became routine. To understand why Enrico felt powerless on Sicily's beaches, one needed only to study the numbers. In Detroit, automobile plants retooled to pour out tanks and trucks instead of sedans. By war's end, the U.S. Army would have purchased 2.4 million trucks, including more than 500,000 GMC CCKW Deuce and a half transports that became the bloodstream of every battlefield. Italian divisions, by contrast, still leaned on mule trains. Aircraft factories roared day and night. Nearly 300,000 planes, fighters, bombers, transports rolled from American plants between 1941 and 1945. Some months saw production figures higher than Italy's entire wartime total. Shermans, the tanks that had lumbered ashore at Gela, numbered nearly 50,000 alone. Add in other armored fighting vehicles and self-propelled guns, and the total surpassed 88,000, a steel-tied Italy could never resist. Then there were the ships. The Liberty-class freighter became a symbol of industrial might. At its peak, one shipyard launched a vessel in 4 days, a publicity stunt that nonetheless reflected a staggering truth. America could replace an entire convoy faster than the Axis could sink one. In total, 2,710 Liberty ships carried armies, fuel, and food across the seas. Alongside them came 1,051 LSTs, each designed to ground itself on beaches and pour out tanks directly onto sand. The statistics seemed unreal, yet they were not exaggerations. In 1943 alone, America produced more steel than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 60% of the world's oil gushed from American wells, fueling everything from Shermans to Liberty engines. Every gallon carried across the Atlantic reminded prisoners like Enrico that scarcity was their reality, abundance their captors. Captain John Miller saw the arsenal in action through logistics reports that read like poetry in numbers: tons per day unloaded, convoys dispatched, depots stocked. For him, the beauty was efficiency, the guarantee that frontline soldiers would never lack for ammunition, rations, or fuel. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt had named it, was not rhetoric, but a measurable, daily fact. In Hereford, Enrico pieced the story together from camp newspapers and guard conversations. The scale seemed incomprehensible, yet the evidence was all around him. The food he ate, the wages he earned, the brushes Burry used. Each item had crossed an ocean on ships that multiplied like swarms, supplied by factories that never slept. The realization landed slowly but irrevocably. Italy had never stood a chance. For every rifle his division carried, America forged 10. For every tank his army fielded, America built hundreds. Scarcity was Italy's ally. Abundance was America's weapon. On July 25, 1943, Mussolini's government fell. The radio announcement reached even into American camps, its tinny broadcast echoing through the barracks at Monticello and Hereford. Prisoners clustered around loudspeakers, straining to hear the Italian king's declaration that the duchy had been dismissed. Some cheered openly, others stood silent, processing the meaning. For Enrico, it was confirmation of what he had already seen on Sicily's beaches. Italy's fight had always been unsustainable. Weeks later came the armistice. On September 8th, Marshal Pietro Badoglio announced Italy had surrendered to the Allies. By October 13th, Italy declared war on Germany, switching sides in a bitter reversal. To American commanders, the news opened opportunity. They formed Italian service units, ISUS, recruiting willing POWs to support the Allied war effort. Nearly 45,000 joined. Donning khaki uniforms marked Italy and working in depots, on farms, and in supply yards. At Camp Monticello, recruiters explained the offer. Those who volunteered would earn wages, move with relative freedom, and contribute to the defeat of their former German allies. Enrico hesitated, but hunger for purpose outweighed pride. He signed on, joining men who now hauled crates of ammunition or tended American crops. The irony was not lost on him. Yesterday's enemies now fueled the very machine that had crushed them. For civilians like Lucia Romano back in Sicily, the collapse was felt differently. German troops streamed in, treating Italian soil as conquered territory. Food grew scarcer. Families that had survived Mussolini's hollow promises now faced occupation by former allies, turned oppressors. When Allied bombers droned overhead, Lucia wondered whether surrender had freed them or simply traded one master for another. Captain John Miller, studying logistics reports, saw Italy's collapse as numbers on a page. New ports opened to Allied use, supply lines shortened, and ISU manpower added depth to his operations. Where once American soldiers had unloaded crates alone, now Italian volunteers joined them. Miller marveled at the transformation. Men captured in battle now fueling the arsenal of democracy, willingly or at least pragmatically. Enrico pulled rations in a depot one afternoon, stacking crates stenciled with U.S. Army markings. He paused, reading the labels: tinned beef, powdered milk, coffee. Each box represented more food than his family in Naples might see in a month. His labor supplied an army that seemed inexhaustible, yet it also secured a paycheck he sent home. It was a bitter irony, American abundance feeding his own family through his hands, even as his nation staggered under war. The revelation was no longer just technical or statistical. It was personal. Enrico had fought for a regime that demanded sacrifice while giving nothing in return. In captivity, under the flag of his conquerors, he found food, work, and even dignity. The war, for Enrico, became measured in small luxuries. One evening in Texas, a guard passed him a tin of peaches. He pried it open, syrup dripping down his fingers, and tasted sweetness his family had not known since before the war. The fruit was ordinary to Americans, but to him it was revelation, proof that even waste in this country outstripped Italy's reserves. Cigarettes became another marker. Cartons of Lucky Strikes and Camels circulated freely in the camp, issued with casual generosity. Enrico smoked slowly, savoring each draw, remembering how his father had bartered for tobacco scraps in Naples. In Italy, scarcity was constant. In America, abundance was routine. Meals reinforced the contrast daily. Breakfast offered eggs, toast, and coffee. Lunch included meat and vegetables. Dinner brought hot dishes served in metal trays, with desserts that still astonished. Puddings, cakes, even ice cream on occasion. Guards ate the same fare as prisoners, underscoring the consistency of supply. To Enrico, it was unthinkable. Fascist propaganda had promised modernity, yet even Italian officers rarely ate so well in uniform. Letters from Sicily painted a darker picture. Lucia Romano wrote of bread lines stretching around corners, of German soldiers requisitioning livestock, of children crying from hunger. She described villages where oil lamps burned because electricity had failed, where mothers watered soup to stretch it for days. Reading those words in the well-lit barracks of Camp Hereford, Enrico felt shame twist inside him. Even leisure bore the mark of plenty. Prisoners bought razors, soap, even musical instruments from the PX. Some saved enough to send small sums home, proof that America could employ its captives better than Italy supported its citizens. Others filled time with soccer matches or films screened in makeshift theaters. Everywhere, abundance whispered the same truth. The United States possessed resources so vast it could share them with enemies without strain. Captain Miller, reviewing supply tallies, saw this abundance quantified. Millions of tons shipped each month, rations standardized and distributed across continents. He knew what Enrico felt intuitively, that the system's strength lay not only in weapons but in the daily certainty of full bellies, clean uniforms, and stocked depots. For Enrico, the canned peach remained the defining symbol. Sweet, preserved, sealed in tin by an assembly line worker he would never meet, it embodied the industrial might of a nation. It tasted of victory, of inevitability, of a future that no fascist parade or speech could match. America, he realized, could feed its enemies better than Italy fed its children. And in that truth, the war's outcome was already written. By 1944, the rhythm of camp life had settled into something almost ordinary. Work details left each morning for farms or depots. Soccer games drew cheering crowds in the afternoons, and evenings filled with card games, choirs, and mass. Beneath the surface, however, a deeper lesson unfolded. Italian POWs, many once steeped in fascist slogans, found themselves living within the quiet routines of American democracy. Enrico noticed it first in the small things. Guards enforced rules but without malice. Disputes were resolved through procedure, not favoritism. Food was distributed equally, officer and enlisted alike receiving the same portions. When prisoners volunteered for labor, their wages were paid on time, recorded carefully in ledgers. It was an order based on fairness, not fear. Alberto Burri, by now immersed in his art, explained it differently. "They win," he said one evening, "because they believe everyone deserves enough. Enough to eat, enough to live, enough to create." That belief makes them stronger than our slogans ever did. His words carried weight in the barracks, where men leafed through American newspapers or studied English with camp-provided texts. Knowledge itself flowed like rations, plentiful, freely offered. For Captain John Miller, the same principle governed logistics. His reports praised not only the tonnage delivered, but the reliability of the system. A sergeant in Kansas could requisition boots and trust they would arrive on schedule in Sicily. That confidence, multiplied across millions of soldiers, became a weapon as potent as any rifle. Lucia Romano, writing from Sicily, described how civilians compared German occupation with American arrival. Where Germans seized livestock and shot deserters, Americans paid for food, handed out chocolate to children, and repaired infrastructure. To families weary of tyranny, such gestures carried the weight of liberation. The POWs saw these truths most starkly in the Italian service units. Wearing American uniforms marked Italy, they worked beside GIs, unloading ships or repairing vehicles. They received respect, pay, and adequate rations. Some even earned furloughs to visit American towns under guard. The irony deepened. Men who once marched under fascist banners now labored inside the arsenal of democracy, and discovered it offered dignity they had never known under Mussolini. For Enrico, the transformation was undeniable. He had entered the war convinced Italy's destiny was greatness. He now understood that greatness came not from speeches or parades, but from a system that valued ordinary lives. Democracy, in practice, was abundance shared. The barbed wire still marked him as a prisoner, yet within it he glimpsed freedoms his nation had promised but never delivered. When the war ended in 1945, Enrico returned home to a land scarred by hunger and ruin. Naples was rubble, railways twisted, factories silent. Italy felt like a ghost compared to the abundance he had witnessed in America. The memory of canned peaches, liberty ships, and endless convoys haunted him, not as dreams, but as proof of why his nation had never stood a chance. Historians would later measure the disparity. America had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, more than all Axis powers combined. It had launched 2,710 Liberty ships and 1,051 LSTS, creating an oceanic conveyor belt that defied submarine warfare. Over 2.4 million trucks rolled from assembly lines, keeping armies mobile across 2 continents. At its height, American wells pumped 60% of the world's oil, fueling bombers, tanks, and fleets without pause. Italy, by contrast, had struggled to keep divisions supplied with boots and bread. The casualty figures told their own story. In Sicily, Allied forces lost over 16,000 men, a grave sacrifice. But Axis losses numbered around 164,000 killed or captured, most of them Italians overwhelmed by firepower and starvation. The ratio revealed the war's cruel arithmetic. Scarcity could not match abundance. For Captain Miller, the reckoning appeared in after-action reports. Supply depots overflowing, ports humming, statistics that confirmed the doctrine of logistics as destiny. For Lucia, it was the sight of American trucks distributing flour to villages where her brothers had starved. For Burri, it was the memory of art born in captivity, a career that began only because America had provided paint to a prisoner. For Enrico, the reckoning lived in memory. He had watched the horizon vanish under thousands of ships, had seen DUKWs crawl from the sea like amphibious beasts, had tasted sugar while his family rationed bread. Each moment was a reminder that victory was not forged in speeches, but in factories, fields, and assembly lines. The irony endured. America's strength had not only destroyed fascism, but also preserved the men sent to defend it. By treating prisoners humanely, by feeding them, employing them, even educating them, the United States proved that its democracy was more powerful than tyranny's brutality. It had conquered not only with steel, but with generosity. Standing years later in a rebuilt Naples, Enrico recalled the taste of those peaches and the sound of Garand rifles rattling on Sicilian sand. He understood at last that America's triumph was not merely military. It was industrial, moral, and human. They never stood a chance, not against a nation that could outproduce, outfight, and outlast its enemies, while still finding room to feed them.